Welcome to the Business of School podcast, brought to you by Cole Connect. Get ready for a journey of topical insights, engaging conversations, and maybe a few aha moments from the business, finance, and technology side of schools. Cole School experts are your host, and with our guests from the world of education, we're about to embark on a learning adventure to support you in the business of your school. Through Platinum Collection Agency, Alice Carter works closely with many schools to achieve practical and cost-effective solutions to collect outstanding fees. Alice has a particular focus to ensure that the school's branding and values are considered and upheld as part of any action. Alice's credit management experience complements her work with schools to enable her to provide advice about the enrolment process, including enrolment terms and split family arrangements. Hello Alice, welcome to the Business of School podcast.
Hi Kenton, thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Always love doing these things with you. And what an interesting topic we've got to talk about today, the enrolment process and how critical that is to school fee collection.
Yes.
So my first question, Alice, is from your perspective, what is the importance of an enrolment form?
Yeah, I think what's probably sometimes not completely appreciated is that the enrolment form is the contract which governs the arrangement between the school and the enrolling family. And so that document needs to include all of the terms that the school would like to apply to the arrangement for the enrolment of the child. And so without that form, it's really unclear to both parties what would be the arrangement that would apply for the duration of the child's time at the particular school. So from my perspective, those forms, whether it be one form or a number of forms that work together, need to be really, really clear to provide the family who's enrolling their child with a good understanding of how the school will provide the service that it is agreeing to provide to the family. Obviously, there needs to be the collection of information from the outset, and that information includes details about the enrolling parties, contact information, and anything else that the school needs in order to set up the account with the family and then be able to manage the account for the duration of the enrolment.
Yeah. So it's interesting, like anyone listening to the podcast would be say, oh, we've got someone talking about their expertise in collecting school fees, and they may be curious, why are we going right back to the beginning of the process to talk about the enrolment form? But it's absolutely crucial, isn't it, to the end result?
And a lot of people, because you only tend to rely on these types of things when there's something going wrong or something that needs to be clarified, sometimes people forget that it's that particular set of documents that are key in order to assist in the first instance trying to resolve a dispute or clarify an issue, or in less cases, enforcing the school's position.
Yep. Yeah. And that package, that portfolio of documents you referred to that often parents and enrolment officers will have to communicate with, how important is the synergy of the information that's replicated across those forms?
Yeah, so from my experience in working with schools, what we find is that, and I think I alluded to it earlier, that there's not just one form that comprises these documents, there's many forms. And it's really, really important to make sure that you review these types of, that your package of forms regularly to ensure that they all speak to one another and there's no inconsistencies.
Yeah, consistency is absolutely key.
That's right, yeah. So you want to make sure that the same terms are used throughout all of the documents so that when parties are reviewing the documents, they're clear about what your expectations, what the school's expectations are for the families that are enrolling their children.
As a lawyer, Alice, can you help us understand what is the important terms that need to be included in an enrolment agreement?
Yeah, so there's different categories of terms that I would say should be included. The first thing that I think is important is that you're asking families to agree to any policies that you might have that you wish to apply. For example, there might be a code of conduct or bullying and harassment, social media, these types of things. They're important that parents agree that those will apply and that they agree to those particular terms. Then, of course, we move to terms related to payment of fees, which is also important. Also, termination of enrolments,
okay.
which is a difficult topic because, again, these are things that you don't want to have to enforce or apply during the course of the enrolment, but should be there so that everyone's clear from the outset about what might apply in the event that something doesn't go to plan.
So from a legal sense, the wording that schools put into these agreements is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and I think you don't need to go overboard with how you put these types of things into your agreements. Just be clear and be concise and make sure it covers all of the areas that are important, because there will be other faith-based wording that you may like to include, and so it's relevant to the school that you are working within. So from my perspective, when I'm working with a school and looking at their enrolment package, I will look at all of these particular points and work out if they've been dealt with or not.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And with the work you do with schools and looking at their enrolment agreements, do you often see unfair contract terms? Are they often included?
Yeah, so it's a topical issue that has arisen in the last 6 months. The legislation changed there were some amendments made that came into effect in November 2023. Now, schools may be the subject to the unfair contracts regime, and so it's important that they consider and get advice where necessary about the terms that are included in their enrolment agreements to ensure that they aren't inconsistent with what's required under the legislation. In my view, probably a terms notice in lieu of fees is the main area that has been the subject of some discussion amongst educational institutions. So it's things like that, the terms that might be considered to place an unfair burden on enrolling parties where the school doesn't otherwise need to necessarily be, in this case, compensated. But of course, there's going to be arguments both ways. And so I think it's important that you seek advice where necessary to understand if there's any issues with respect to the terms.
Yeah, okay. And again, it highlights how crucial it is that there is legal advice given as part of this process.
That's right.
Yeah, definitely. And we've all seen a whole spectrum of enrolment forms that have been completed by parents that enrolment officers have to collect. And hey, as a parent, I've had to sit there and fill out copious pages when filling these out for my many kids. How important is it the accurate details that an enrolment officer collects as part of this workflow? I mean, there's parts of the form that can get left blank, or ambiguity in what's been put on the form. How important is that when we think about the final result with the debt collection?
Yeah, I mean, from a collections perspective, accurate information is key because it's going to make it a lot easier for you to be able to contact and communicate with the enrolling parties. From my perspective, when you have multiple sets of forms that require parties to complete them and sign them, that's where we see inconsistencies arise. For example, when you have an application form that's signed by both parents and then an acceptance form that's only signed by one parent, or you may have different parties because parties don't understand that you're asking them to sign various forms. So there's issues like that arise that, again, if you can have a good process within your office, your team from the outset when you're reviewing these types of forms that get returned, then that's going to hopefully, fingers crossed, reduce any errors or issues in those particular forms down the track if you ever do need to come back to them and rely on them.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned in there where there's more than one party, and with parents and caregivers in schools today, it's coming more increasing a challenge where there's more than one party with each enrolment. What would you suggest that schools do where one party wants to maybe vary the terms of the enrolment or don't agree with what the other one's put on one of the forms?
Yeah, and that's a challenge for schools to, in my view, schools need to set some parameters around variations and requests for changes. I think importantly, schools need to be consistent because when you start making different rules for different families based on a case-by-case basis, then it makes it very hard to enforce a consistent approach because depending on the circumstances of the request, you may then start thinking about, fairness reasons and other things like that might not be necessarily relevant when you apply against other individual cases that might arise. And so I think consistency is key. So when your team meets, you agree a process for dealing with variations. Now, some schools don't allow them at all, and that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah.
But then in other cases, there might be situations arise because of family court orders or other different issues that do make it appropriate. But be consistent and make sure that everyone's on the same page so that when you communicate your decisions, you are communicating a consistent approach amongst your team.
And is there a practical process that schools need to go through if there is a variation?
So if you do agree to vary your enrolment agreement, remembering back to what we spoke about in the first instance, that your enrolment agreement is your contract. So what follows is if you make an agreement to vary terms, then that's going to be a variation to your contract. So remember that if you then have a dispute or you need to enforce part of your agreement, that variation will be relevant.
Yep.
Now, how do you vary a contract? Well, best practice is to record it in writing and get it signed.
By both parties?
By both parties. Both parties or whoever signed the enrolment contract to begin with.
To maintain that consistency.
Must be consistent, that's right. And so if you do that and you record it in writing and get it signed, everyone's going to be on the same page.
Can you give us an example of where there may be an issue for where one party's wanted to do a variation?
Yeah, so most commonly we see issues arise when one parent requests a variation and the other parent may not agree to the variation, and we then have a situation where the school may make a decision with one parent and not the other. So within that scenario, there's a communication issue because you can't be making, when you think back to your original agreement where you've got two parents signing, it wouldn't be lawful for you to then make an agreement with one parent without including the other. And so you have to be very careful about making sure that both parties to the original agreement are in the loop and are in agreement as to what variation needs to occur. For example, one parent is asking to be removed from the enrolment. That's not uncommon. And then the other remaining parent isn't in agreement. So you have an inconsistent position. Now, if you were to maintain that position with the parent that is asking, yep, I'll stay, I don't want to be on there, and then you've got the parent saying, the other parent saying, no, well, I'm not happy with that, then you'll find yourself in a predicament about whether you can even pursue either of the parties legally for the collection of the fees. And so you can see very quickly that it becomes quite complicated. And if you'd had a clear process from the outset about communication and dealing with variations, in my view, the answer to the parent saying, I want to be removed would have been, I'll check with the other parent, I'll need to speak with them, and pending their agreement, that might be something that we can accommodate.
Yeah. And what should be a simple collection process can be so complicated just because of these small things at the very beginning of the process. And they sound simple. But I know from our data manager team, when they're out there helping schools collecting fees, and from your collection team, that these are some of the challenges that are happening all the time. It sounds simple, but these are things that schools are getting wrong often.
Yeah, that's right. And I think finance teams, business managers, they've already got a lot to work within on a daily basis. And so I think these types of things just add another layer of complexity to their roles. And I think that and we go back to talking about consistency and communication, and I think if you can be really clear on those things, it'll make things a lot easier, because you won't have parents arguing with you saying, oh, yeah, but you did that there and you're not doing it here, and I know that so-and-so got this and you're now not doing this. And, it just creates all of these, unnecessary conversations which could have been dealt with from the outset if you could refer to a policy that says, well, no, this is what we agree, and it's not in accordance with our policy and therefore we can't accommodate it.
Yeah. Let's talk about family court orders. What, if any, does the impact of a family court order have on the enrolment and liability for fees?
Yeah, so unfortunately, a majority of the matters that we end up with in fee collection are as a consequence of a family separation that has happened at some point during the enrolment. We understand that they're very difficult. There's very difficult circumstances in most cases within those matters. Family, and the reason they end up, I think, a majority of the time with us is perhaps communication could have been better during the enrolment with the parents regarding the expectations that the school has. And the family court orders themselves, importantly, the school isn't a party to those orders.
No.
So they're not bound, the school isn't bound to follow what has been agreed between the parties. Again, loop it back.
And that's an often misconception, isn't it?
It is a misconception. And I think schools feel, schools are empathetic to those types of situations, and they do want to at least understand what it is that the parties are agreeing with one another, because that can actually make it easier to recover what is outstanding at whatever point in time the separation occurs. So loop it back though to your contract. So your contract's going to be, that's who your contract's between the school and the enrolling parties, and that'll govern in the first instance what the terms are relating to fees, whether it be they're jointly and severally liable, or you have agreed a variation at a subsequent time where there's been a fee split that's not in accordance with a joint and several liability position. And so the family court orders, when they're made, I think it's important that schools view a copy of them if possible. And it might be that you obtain a copy that's redacted because some of the information isn't relevant. But I think it's important that you understand. And then it's a matter for the school adopting its own internal policies, how it deals with those orders. Do you follow the orders because the parents have agreed a certain way forward in order to get their fees and deal with the enrolment with the school? Or is there something else in there that's relevant? And then communicate with both of the parents or whoever the parties are to the enrolment, the original enrolment, to then agree how this is all going to work. And then once you've got that in place, then you just adopt it. But importantly, you don't have to, because you should always remember with a variation, you may be limiting your ability to recover fees in the event that, for example, the remaining parent on the enrolment, say in the case of an enrolment where you agree to only fee responsibility is only then with one party, or a majority of the fee responsibility is with one party, what would happen in the event that party declared bankruptcy? We couldn't locate that party. They no longer had contact with the children, in which case you may not have an easy way of getting in touch with the parent. There's lots of different things that can happen, and so it's important to kind of think forwards in a way as to how do we think this enrolment, how many years there are left on the enrolment. Are we at the end? Are we in the middle, beginning, etc.? How many children? Think about the future if you can, in a way to understand whether you are in a position to agree to vary your enrolment in accordance with the family court orders. It's not uncommon for one parent to take full responsibility for fees.
Yeah. And
is that going to be viable for you as a school to also follow that?
Yeah, okay. Well, keeping on the topic of separated families, how does a school deal with separated families when attempting to recover fees from both parents?
Yeah, so I think just remember that the school isn't bound, and it's extremely common for one of the first things for us to be told with a separated family is, oh, but so-and-so agreed to pay the fees. And so I come back to the contractual responsibility and then whether there's a variation that's relevant or not. And then we communicate with both parties to ensure that they understand what the legal position is. Because I think that there is a misunderstanding on the part of parents when they agree these orders as to then what that means legally. And I think where we have one proactive parent who might be the parent that's paid or hasn't had much contact from the school about the other parent's failure to comply, it can make the situation very difficult to deal with because they feel like they've been left in the dark. and they weren't. They had no coverage on how bad the situation was in terms of non-payment. And so when we deal with separated families, we make a real effort to make sure that both parents understand the position and who's legally responsible. And I think that schools, without a doubt, schools are dealing with lots of different complexities within families. And I think that these are difficult conversations to have. But I think if internally they can have as part of their policies something on their checklist which says, like, do we need to deal with mum or dad or both, and make sure that there's a consistent follow-up on these types of things when they become aware a family is separated, or in the event there is a separated family from the commencement of the enrolment, I think it makes things a lot simpler.
Okay. Let's try and pull the two ends of the workflow together with the enrolment process and the timely fee recover. In your view and your experience working with schools, what role does the business manager and their broader finance team play in bringing those two things together?
Yeah, and I think the business manager and their team, they are the ones that really, they can set up a good system in order to manage these types of issues. And so I think enrolment documents, we've already been over that. That's key. So making sure the team is across what the expectations and the approach is going to be when
and
dealing
that will
with families.
need some relationship between the enrolment department and the finance department.
That's right. Yeah, so depending on how large the school is, there could be, a large number of team members that need to collaborate on these types of things, because the finance team might not have much coverage in accepting the enrolment forms, and so they're not aware of what issues necessarily arise at that time. And likewise, the enrolment team might not be aware of the difficulties that can arise with fee collection if they don't have exposure to those types of conversations. And so collaboration is so important, and some type of written internal document that kind of doesn't need to go through things chapter and verse, but gives people a bit of an understanding about how you're going to deal with any type of requests that you might get. Like a variation is like the key one, I think. What's your response to those types of requests? Acknowledging them is one thing, but then responding to them is another. And how do you respond to them when you want to have like we've been through, consistency, when you want to have that consistent approach?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being with us on the Business of School podcast today. I think it's so important to emphasise to schools how critical the enrolment process is to the collection function of the school, and helping out with cash flow and financial viability. It's seeing all these business units in the school linked together is so important. So we really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today on that, and we look forward to catching up with you again on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Business of School podcast. We've enjoyed the conversation today and would love to have you join us for future episodes. Please hit the subscribe button and follow the links below to find more information and resources to support you and your school team. Until next time, keep being innovative, keep being awesome, and remember, there is always opportunity to improve on the journey. Thanks for connecting.